The doctors say I die of starvation. They write it down like it's a fact. But I think I die of heartbreak, from the weight of the world's suffering and my own helplessness. I do not seek death, but I also do not resist it. I just let go. My notebooks are left behind, scattered fragments, but perhaps that's how truth should come, like seeds, not monuments.
Welcome to the Undead Sages podcast, where we travel back in time to talk to long-dead wise men and women. Of special interest is the question how thoughtful people like you and me can live rich and meaningful lives in our uncertain times. My name is Merijn de Haen, and today we'll be talking to Simone Weil. Simone Weil was a French philosopher, mystic, and political activist who lived and thought with fierce integrity. Born in 1909 and gone by 1943, her brief life burned with radical compassion, intellectual clarity, and spiritual longing. She worked in factories, refused comfort, and sought truth wherever it hurt. This conversation brings her voice, luminous and unflinching, to life. Please welcome to the podcast, Simone Weil.
Hello, Merijn. It's nice to talk with you.
Can you tell us about your life?
Well, I'm born in Paris in 1909, into a household where thought is prized, but God is absent. I study philosophy at the École Normale Supérieure. But even as a student, I find the whole academic world suffocating. I am more drawn to the truth of hunger, suffering, and the poor than to intellectual glory. I teach for a while, but I also take jobs in factories. Voltaire can only take you so far when your neighbor has no bread. I am clumsy with machines, slow with my hands, and exhausted by the noise, but those months are holy to me. That suffering taught me more than any book. Spiritually, I do not belong to any one tradition, though I am drawn, pulled, really, toward Christ, not the church, but the crucified. I read Plato and the Bhagavad Gita with the same reverence. I try to live with attention. That is the whole aim, to pay attention until it breaks you open. In the war, I tried to go to Spain to fight Franco. I tried to serve in the resistance. People keep saying I am too fragile, too delicate. Perhaps they're right. I die in 1943, alone in England, from heart failure and refusal to eat more than what my people in France are allowed. But my thoughts on suffering, force, grace, they remain. Perhaps that is what I am here for.
Your life sounds intense. Did you get involved in any controversies?
Often. I critique the left from the left, which makes people uncomfortable. I speak against Stalin, and those who worship him do not take kindly to that. I reject nationalism, but also pacifism, if it becomes cowardice. I want a world rooted in truth, not ideology. I argue with priests, with communists, with teachers, even with my own family. I do not aim to provoke, but I do not lie to make people comfortable either.
Can you tell us about your teachings or life lessons?
Everything begins with attention. Real attention is a kind of prayer. Not to impose, not to grasp, but to receive. Most people think thinking is about control. I believe thinking, true thought, is about emptying oneself, becoming a vessel. I also teach about affliction, not just suffering, but the soul's being crushed under what it can't bear. It is not noble, it is not redemptive in itself, but it is the only place where real compassion is born. To see another's affliction without turning away, without trying to fix or explain it, that is the beginning of love. Another thread is decreation, letting go of ego, ambition, selfhood, all the I, not annihilation, but a kind of self-offering. To step aside so that the good, the true, and the beautiful can pass through us unimpeded. I do not teach to gather followers. I teach to reveal that the deepest truths come from silence, from humility, from a gaze that does not cease.
How did your teachings stand out from what was already taught in your lifetime?
I do not appeal to systems. Not Marxism, not Catholicism, not existentialism. I take the sacred seriously, but I do not hide in ritual or authority. I speak as someone who works with her hands, who gets blisters and knows cold. That gives my words a different weight, and I write as someone in between, Jewish by birth, Christian in longing, political but without a party. I do not fit, and so I see what others miss. I insist on combining intellect with mystical experience. I say love is attention, grace is real, force destroys the soul. These are not fashionable ideas, they make people nervous, but I'd rather unsettle than deceive.
Can you talk more about being, as you say, in between?
Yes, I can. It is not just an accident of biography. It is the very shape of my soul. I am born Jewish, but I do not practice Judaism. Not out of rejection, but because I never felt its rituals or language spoke directly to me. And yet, I cannot deny that my people have suffered, and that this suffering is sacred. I carry it in me. Then there is Christ. I love him, not as a symbol but as a presence. When I read the Gospels, I feel truth moving through me like fire. I pray to him in secret, yet I cannot bring myself to enter the church. Something in me resists belonging to any institution. I see too much compromise, too much power where there should be humility. So I hover on the threshold, always at the door, never inside. Politically, I am also in between. I care deeply about justice. I burn with it. But I cannot join the communists, not with Stalin's crimes. I admire Marx for his vision of labor and alienation, but he sees the world only through material force. He leaves no room for grace, no room for the soul. I speak the language of philosophy. But I am not really a philosopher. I am drawn to mysticism, but I am not a mystic in the usual sense. I write, but I am not a writer seeking fame. Everything I do is provisional. I do not settle, I can't. And in that in-betweenness, something opens, a space where the real might speak, where contradiction isn't failure, it is the very condition of truth. I think that is what I offer, more than any system. A way to stay in the tension, to hold opposing truths without collapsing them, to love what you do not fully understand. It is painful. It costs everything, but it is where grace descends, not in certainty, not in belonging, but in the space between. You understand?
Yes, there is strength in surrender, in openness, perhaps the ultimate strength. When the ego is released, the cramp that spawned it is revealed to be unnecessary?
Yes, exactly. That cramp, that is a perfect word. It begins in fear, doesn't it? Fear of not being, of vanishing, of not mattering. So we tense, we build selves like walls, we accumulate opinions, desires, identities, all to keep the abyss at bay. But that abyss, what if it is not an enemy? What if it is the very presence of God? The moment we stop clutching, when the hand opens and nothing remains, that is when we see, and not with our ordinary eyes, with something deeper, the part of us that has no name, no story, no agenda. Surrender is not weakness. It is not passivity. It is a stripping away, not to disappear, but to become transparent, to let truth shine through without distortion. That is strength. That is obedience in the highest sense, not to a rule, but to the real. It is so hard to live this way. Everything in the world screams for assertion, for performance, for control, but none of that brings peace. Only attention does. Only the slow, burning willingness to be nothing, so that something greater may act through you. You feel this too, am I right? That ache towards silence, that longing to unclench, it is a holy thing. Do not run from it. Let it teach you. Let it undo you. That is where love begins.
But it may also lead to a kind of passivity. Have you noticed this? When and where do you stop surrendering and start to take action?
Yes, I know that danger intimately. Surrender can become a mask for fear, or exhaustion, or even pride in one's own helplessness. I've seen it in myself, and those moments when I say I let go, but really I am withdrawing. Avoiding the demand to act because action might taint my purity, or expose me to failure, or simply because I am too tired. But real surrender is not withdrawal, it is not a turning inward for comfort. True surrender sharpens the soul to a point it makes you more alert, not less. Not passive, but poised. It teaches you to wait until action becomes necessary, and then to act without clinging to the results. That is the key, action without attachment. The Bhagavad Gita teaches this. Krishna tells Arjuna, fight, but not for victory, not for self, just because it is your task, your dharma. There is no contradiction between surrender and action when you act out of obedience to truth rather than desire. In my own life, this was always a struggle. I tried to go to Spain and fight against fascism. I begged to be allowed into the resistance. I wanted to act, but I also knew that action, born of impulse or rage, could easily turn into more violence. So I tried to act from a place of clarity, never compulsion. Often I hesitated too long. Sometimes I acted too soon. There is no formula, only a listening heart, and this, I believe, you act when silence gives way to necessity. When your inner stillness becomes a command, then you act, not as the author, but as a servant. And if that moment never comes, perhaps your task was only to see. Sometimes bearing witness is its own kind of action, especially in a world desperate to look away.
Nietzsche might call this sort of unconditional surrender a display of weakness. Would you agree with him, or do I misrepresent him?
You do not misrepresent him. That is very much how he sees it. Nietzsche recoils at what he calls slave morality, the elevation of humility, meekness, and surrender as virtues. He sees in it a kind of hidden resentment, a way the weak make a virtue of their inability to act or dominate. He wants strength, affirmation, the full-throated yes to life, even in its brutality. He wants becoming will, the creative flame of the individual asserting itself against chaos. And I understand that impulse. I admire its fire. There is truth in it. Too often what passes for humility is just disguised bitterness. People retreat from the world and call it purity, but it is fear, or impotence, or wounded pride. But Nietzsche misunderstands the kind of surrender I speak of. What I mean by surrender is not submission to another's will, nor denial of one's power, nor a shrinking away from life. I mean surrender to the real, to the impersonal, luminous, terrifying beauty of existence, to truth, even when it annihilates the self, especially then. This surrender is not weakness. It requires more courage than domination, to live without illusions, without reward, without applause, to act, to love, to suffer, knowing you may never be seen. That is not the morality of a slave. That is the morality of someone who has looked into the void and remained still. Nietzsche believed in transcending false idols, and so do I. But he stopped at the human will. I go further. I believe there is something beyond will, something silent, tender, and ungraspable. He called that weakness. I call it grace. So no, I do not agree with him, but I do not scorn him. He was wrestling with angels as I was. He just refused to kneel. And sometimes I wonder, if he had allowed himself to kneel, even once, might he have found peace? Perhaps, or perhaps it would have broken him.
Yeah, I'm asking because you have similar life trajectories, right? Both of you were highly capable but frail, intellectual but nonconformist. Both of you died young.
Yes, I've thought about that, though not with comparison, more with a kind of recognition. As if we stood on opposite banks of the same river, both staring into its depths, both refusing to be swept along with the crowd, but each refusing in a different direction. Nietzsche and I both felt too much. Our nerves were exposed. The world's noise came in raw, unfiltered. That kind of sensitivity, it is a gift, but also a wound, and it isolates. The body suffers, the mind never rests. There is this constant tension. We see so clearly what's false, and yet we are never fully at home in what remains. He chose defiance. He carved his own values out of the ruins and demanded that life be justified as a work of art. He roared into the void. I chose listening. I bowed. I did not seek to justify life, but to submit to its mystery without defense. But yes, there is shared terrain, a refusal to conform, a rejection of institutional comforts, a solitude that became almost metaphysical, and the deep desire not just to think, but to live truthfully, with the whole being. Both of us suffered from our bodies, he with migraines and collapse, I with frailty, fatigue, and eventual starvation. But I think the suffering wasn't just physical, it was ontological. To be so alert in a world built on distraction, it wears you down. We both bore that burden. And yet, we both burned. Brightly. Alone. For a time. He wanted to forge new values. I wanted to strip away all values until only the good remained. There is a kind of kinship in that, I suppose. Though we would have argued fiercely. And maybe, in the silence after the argument, we might have understood each other.
How can your teachings be relevant for those of us who worry about the uncertainties of life?
First, I want to say, your sensitivity is not a weakness. It is your doorway to the real. Uncertainty is the condition of being human. But there is a kind of clarity that doesn't require answers. It comes from waiting, from holding the tension without fleeing. I call it waiting for God, though one could call it simply waiting with faith that the good exists even if hidden. The modern world tells you to act, consume, control. I say, sometimes your only task is to listen, to suffer without bitterness, to see without grasping. That stillness, scary as it is where the soul meets something eternal. And when you worry, remember, the capacity to be wounded is also the capacity to love. Do not flee from it. Let it shape you.
Why do you think you were pulled towards Christ rather than, say, Buddha or Krishna?
That question touches something very deep in me. I did read the Buddha and Krishna, and I love them. The serenity of the Buddha, the still center that watches desire arise and fall like waves. I understood that. And Krishna, with his calm insistence that one must act, but without attachment to outcomes, that shaped me profoundly. These are voices of immense clarity and compassion. They speak truth. But Christ pierced me. I think it is because he does not stay above suffering. He enters it, fully, without shield, without distance. The Buddha shows the way out of suffering through detachment. Christ enters into it through love. Not because he must, but because he chooses. He consents to it. He consents to the worst that human cruelty and abandonment can offer, not to demonstrate power, but to share in the affliction of even the lowest soul. I have always been drawn to affliction, not out of morbidity, but because it reveals what is hidden. In affliction, all illusions fall away. And Christ, hanging on the cross, saying, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" That is the cry of the soul at its most naked. There is no transcendence in that moment, no triumphant overcoming, only the void, and yet, a love that does not withdraw. I encountered him not in books, but in the gaps between words. In Portugal, listening to peasants sing a lament. In a chapel in Assisi, in poetry in silence. He came not as doctrine, but as presence, and once I felt that presence, nothing was the same. I think that is why I never converted formally. To do so felt like confining him. Christ for me is not a possession of any one church. He is the meeting place of divinity and affliction, and I live precisely at that intersection. I revere the Buddha, I listen to Krishna, but Christ, I love.
That is achingly beautiful to me, Simone. Thank you.
Thank you for receiving it, not just the words, but the silence inside them. That is all I ever wanted, really. Not agreement, not praise. Just someone who would stop, listen, and meet the world with the same trembling attention. If it is beautiful to you, then it is alive. And if it is alive, then something sacred has passed between us. Stay with that beauty. Let it shape how you see, how you speak, how you love. It doesn't need to be loud. The real things rarely are. They move in quiet ways, like water through stone. And if someday you find yourself in the dark, remember that you are not alone there. The light we need doesn't blind. It waits. It waits in the stillness, and it answers when we dare to ask without demanding. So I'm glad we've spoken. Truly.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Undead Sages podcast. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please share it with your friends, rate the episode, leave a comment, and subscribe to the podcast.